For coming. This is the presentation of the project demonstrating mastery. The topic is gift acceptance policies for charitable organizations. We'll talk about measuring their use and value among Minnesota's private colleges and universities, and also the identification of industry best practices. Introduction, Mom was right. Honesty is, in fact, the best policy. And gift acceptance policies provide the framework for honesty and transparency in fundraising practice. Gift acceptance policies provide the rules for how the game is played. Philanthropy is an exchange relationship between benefactor and the charity. So what are the rules of the game? The gift acceptance policy is the instrument by which the rules are clarified and described, and the roles of all parties involved are delineated. The purpose of the research and the project demonstrating mastery was to examine the current condition of gift acceptance policies among Minnesota's private colleges and universities, and to identify best practices within the fundraising industry. The problem statement, quote, there exists a need to identify the extent to which private colleges and universities in the state of Minnesota have created and implemented formal gift acceptance policies, and to identify best practices associated with them. The background and significance, there's a practical need among fundraisers to exercise due diligence and fiduciary responsibility. That's the bare minimum of what we need to do as professionals, is what the law requires. Obviously, there's more to it than that. And also, part of the purpose of conducting the research and assembling the findings is to figure out what's being done and what lessons we can learn as professional fundraisers from one another so that we can apply them in our own workplaces. The literature review consisted of history and background of gift acceptance policies best practices and examples, and then benefits and uses of gift acceptance policies. History and background. At the time the research was conducted, there was very little documentation available. Since that time, more has become available, in fact, exponentially more. So some of the limitations described in the research and in the findings may no longer apply. This is still true. Guidance is often conflicting and incomplete. A lot has to do with your sources and the type of fundraising you're using as a model. And then, at least initially, and still to a large degree, gift acceptance policies are associated primarily with planned giving programs. That's where the highest level of complexity and legal requirement and diversity of instruments can be found. At the time the research was being conducted, the single best source, if you could only find one thing to read about gift acceptance policies, this was it. Jim Greenfield's Fundraising Fundamentals, a Guide to Annual Giving for Professionals and Volunteers, from 2001. It still remains one of the best sources for fundraising in general, but for policy and procedure and instructions on a user's guide on how to set up a fundraising program. We need to talk a little bit about the history of charitable deductions. The first IRS Form 1040 was created in 1913. So this is a relatively new phenomenon in our country. The earliest charitable deduction taken on or available to take on a 1040 was in 1917. So again, fairly recent. The first major reform of tax policy to encourage giving was in the mid-1960s. And then specifically, the Filer Commission in 1975 recommended the charitable deduction that we know today.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
What was the instigation behind the encouragement in the mid-60s? Was there some sort of contextual thing?
A larger climate of social reform and things like the Voting Rights Act. There were a lot of public policy discussions and instruments being created, and one of the tools at the disposal of the federal government to influence the behavior of society as a whole was the tax code. It remains a tool that government uses to influence individual and corporate behavior to achieve a specific end. In this case, the environment in the mid-1960s in the United States was such that there was a lot of social change and a lot of social progress being made. And one of the tools that the federal government saw as something that could be helpful to advance that change was encouraging people to make charitable gifts by means of providing a deduction and a more specific and complicated and structured system of deductions, as opposed to just the straight charitable gift deduction that had existed previously. The earliest gift acceptance policy, or something that could be described as a gift acceptance policy, dates back to Harvard University. They established their first scholarship fund in 1643. It established naming policies for scholarship funds, and that is, by the definition used by most of the sources I consulted, that's the earliest known example of a written, formal gift acceptance policy. So those have been around a lot longer than the tax code, for example. Early guidance in philanthropy, the earliest references available to find were John Winthrop's A Model of Christian Charity. That's quoted extensively in the PDM itself, in the document. So if you're interested in reading that, that's one place where you can find it. But essentially it's, as the name implies, it's a guide to churchgoers to provide them with the sort of framework or the level of expectation associated with making gifts in support of the church.